This presentation is entitled Family Dynamics, one of many important discussions that will help to prepare you for your work with patients and families that Tamarisk serves. Now, it might seem obvious to note that as you volunteer, you'll be working not only with the individual facing life-threatening illness, but with their family, and often within their home. Well, this is true, of course, so we want to equip you with some basics that will help you to work well with a myriad of different types of family situations, some of which can be quite challenging, so that you can offer the best care possible while enjoying the relationships that you build with these patients and families you serve. Now, in this presentation, we will discuss some basic concepts about families, characteristics about how they work, how they respond to changes and seek to maintain a sense of normalcy or balance. We'll talk about rules, roles, and relationships and how these are important characteristics for you to understand so that you can more easily recognize and respond well to the changes that each family faces. We'll talk specifically about some of the challenges that are unique to families of dying patients, and finish with some practical tips to help the Tamarisk volunteer discover your role with these families. Now, as you go through the lesson, please follow your printout of the PowerPoint, take notes as you go, and be ready to pause the presentation at times in order to complete some reflections about your own family, and to work through a few scenarios that you would likely encounter when working with Tamarisk families. These reflections are an important part of your own preparation, so please be sure to complete them as we will talk about these things as a group. Well, let's take just a moment before we begin to listen to two quick stories from Carmen and Anne, some Tamarisk volunteers. Now, my hope is just to give you a quick glimpse of the joys and challenges that our volunteers encounter every day.
One of the earliest companions I had was a beautiful young woman with stage 4 breast cancer. Her name was Stephanie. The illness was devastating. Her personal life was a nightmare. She had divorced an abusive husband and struggled with 3 adult children with multiple severe problems. During the 3 years I spent with her, we developed a very close relationship. Her mother came from New York when she could leave her ill husband. She was able to be at her daughter's bedside for the last weeks of her life. When the end came, Stephanie's mother was alone and devastated. My challenge was to help her. She stayed at my house for a few days. I did not want her to be alone. Together, we made all the funeral arrangements. She was so overwhelmed that with her approval, I ended making many of the final decisions. I was so honored by her trust. When we volunteered with Tamarisk, we build relationships with the whole family, and often these relationships go on for a long time. I was in touch with Stephanie's mother until she died a few years ago.
Hi, my name is Anne, and I am a volunteer at Tamarisk. I worked with a gentleman who had Parkinson's and dementia, who was a very pleasant gentleman to get to know. We would go outside for wheelchair rides, talk about things, and it was just a good experience to have met him. One of my more challenging clients was a woman who lived with her daughter who was a hoarder. In that situation, I found it very difficult to stay present and focus on the patient because I wanted to throw away spoiled food, dirty diapers, and I wanted to, pick up so that I wasn't walking on clothes or different items as I went through the house in order to take care of the client. So that's quite a challenge and hard to stay focused.
Well, let's begin quickly with some thoughts that help us to define a family. So here you see a definition from the American Heritage Dictionary that perhaps captures the essence of what we mean when we talk about our family, that inner circle of those who are closest to us. Two or more people who share the same goals and values, have long-term commitments to one another, and reside usually in the same dwelling place. So just who is typically part of the family? Well, sometimes a family includes only the immediate family, parents and their children. Sometimes people also include neighbors, friends, co-workers, people who have become so close that they are considered part of the family. Depending upon cultural background, extended family and other relatives can also be part of this close-knit group considered family. At other times, members of the immediate family are excluded from the definition of who makes up the family. This may happen because of divorce or other estrangements. And finally, even those coming in to offer support can become part of the family as defined by the patient. As a Tamarisk volunteer, you might have the privilege of being considered part of the family as you support them and gain their trust and friendship over time. So with all those ideas in mind about who might make up a family, let's take a look about how a family works. A family is a system. Now, just like a car that has many parts that are different yet work together to make it go, a family has different members. Families are, quote, put together, if you will, by the relationships between each member, and as each member fills different roles that help to serve and make the family function. Now, there is, of course, lots of psychology and theoretical discussion we could get into at this point, but I think there are really just a few things that are important for Tamarisk volunteers to recognize. So I hope this simple illustration is helpful. So as I said, a family is a system, just like a cell. It's separate from its environment and yet responds to things that go on inside and outside. Every family, as a unit, develops its own internal rules, a way that things work. These rules are traditions, or, quote, the way we do things. It keeps the family in balance, and every family will strive to keep that balance or peace and a sense of normalcy, that all is well. A family is made up of relationships that are constantly changing. Sometimes these changes are natural. For instance, a family begins when two people who fall in love. Well, that relationship will change as a baby comes along. Not only does the relationship change, but now there are new roles, things to do, as I perhaps am now a mom as well as a wife, or dad as well as a husband. The family becomes more complex as more children come. I'm sure you can think of examples as brothers or perhaps stepsisters come along, and how some siblings are closer to some than others, or closer to one parent. And of course, the day comes when a child grows up and moves away from the home, and their role and their part in the family is forever changed. So we will unpack some of these thoughts as we continue the presentation. But there are two things that Tamarisk volunteers need to understand and remember from this simple, and I hope very impressive, visual illustration. First of all, each family that you encounter has had years and even generations of developing relationships, rules about how things are done, etc. And it'll take time for you to get to understand them. Also, every family you work with will have different ideas about how those relationships work, what goals are important for their family. Some families will be easy for you to understand and work with. Others will be a challenge as you encounter things that you may disagree with, don't think are helpful, or are just simply very different. And a second point that follows directly and is just as important as this: you are an external influence to every family you serve. You come to them from outside that circle. That's an important point for you to remember. This means a number of things that we'll discuss more in depth as we go. That it is not your responsibility to change how this family works. You are free instead to just simply help and support them. Also, you will likely have a very limited ability to influence and change, unless you've developed enough trust and knowledge of the family to be given permission to make some suggestions. So let's talk more in detail about how a family works. What are some characteristics of families that we can keep in mind to help us get to know them more quickly and understand how and why they function as they do? Well, first of all, as you recall in our pink circle, the idea that every family is a cell, its own unit. So the topic here is that a family is self-regulating. Now that might seem an obvious statement, but a very important one for us to realize that as an outsider, we will not be able to change the way a family system functions. We might be able to influence, but changes ultimately only come when family members decide to accept them. Another characteristic: every family has a purpose. To support each other and the individual, of course. But beyond this, each family will have different goals, things that they feel are important. Understanding what things are important to a family will help you serve them better, as you may have opportunity to help them accomplish that goal in the midst of the changes and challenges that life-threatening illness brings. Some examples? Well, I know families that place a high value on physical activity, and everyone's expected to be engaged in sports or regular fitness routines. I know families where faith commitments are important, and Sunday mornings and how they spend their Sundays often define them. They have a desire to give back by volunteering to the community in some way. Many families in Minnesota value summer vacations and trips to the cabin. The family might value the arts, education, or have clear goals for careers, or being close to extended family. Another characteristic? Well, of course, we already said that families are built on relationships. So here's just an obvious list of different ways that relationships in a family are formed and the different interactions that make up a family. Now, these last two bullet points are what makes families so dynamic, different, and unique. Number 4, I guess, every family member will have different roles. What mom does in one family may be very different than what mom does in another. For instance, these roles may be decided on things like their gender. Males or females, mom and dad, have different roles. Maybe the age, whether they're an adult or child or an infant or teen. Their place in the family. Sometimes there are things that the first child or the only child is expected to do that others aren't. Roles in a family are often seen as defined jobs to do, practical ways they contribute to the well-being of the family, like mow the lawn or wash the dishes. Roles in the family are also seen in how each member contributes to managing relationships. The peacemaker, the rule breaker, the listener, the decision maker, the comedian. I'm sure you can think of people who have filled those roles in your family or in people you know. And finally, the last characteristic of families in general is that every family will have rules, clearly defined ideas about what's important, how things are done, when they are done, etc. Some of these rules are spoken and clearly stated, and every family member knows them. For instance, in my family growing up, we were told often that you made your bed each morning before leaving for school, that Saturday was, quote, job day, and so we all knew that we needed to ask mom and dad what needed to be done around the house before we could run off to play with our friends. Some rules in families are never talked about, but implicitly understood. In my family, again, I don't recall any conversations about college or further education. Both of my parents were teachers, and they placed a high value on learning. It was just simply an assumption that we would all go to college. The only question was where, and for what. Unspoken rules, unfortunately, can also be negative in a family. That perhaps anger is not allowed to be expressed, or nobody ever talks about mom or dad's drinking. These would be types of rules that are not so much stated as they are created by people's responses when the invisible line is crossed. And finally, every family has a myriad of traditions or habits about the way things get done. You may not think of it so much as a rule, but think about how people react when the expected Christmas celebration tradition is broken, or how a child comes to expect certain things as part of the bedtime routine each day. Traditions and rules help define the family and help each member know what to expect and also what's expected of them. So with all of these thoughts in mind, I'd like you to take some time now and to pause or even stop the presentation and reflect a while on your own family. In your binder, you will find a sheet that's called Volunteer Reflection Family Dynamics. Please fill in the responses to the first question now, and we'll pause to fill in the rest of that worksheet as we go through the presentation. Now, with all the variables that we've just discussed, I'm sure you can see why we talk about family dynamics. Families are constantly dealing with changes from both within and without. And as mentioned, every family will seek to maintain a sense of normalcy, of peace, and that all is well. Now, every family will respond to many tensions such as those listed here. And when these changes occur, the family will adjust its relationships, its rules, its roles, as needed in order to find balance again. Now, these changes may be positive or negative. For instance, a family that welcomes a new baby into the home goes through big changes. The relationship between husband and wife is never the same again. New roles are created, and the parents begin to consider what rules, traditions they'll bring in order to raise the child. On the other hand, consider the changes a family faces when, for instance, mom is hospitalized for a time due to a serious car accident. If injuries are life-changing, relationships are often affected and need to adjust. Roles in the family need to change, at least for a time, as mom is not able to work perhaps, or do laundry, provide encouragement. Whatever skills and gifts she brings will either need to be replaced or let go for a while. Rules and habits might need to change as dad becomes the taxi for all the kids, or decisions might need to be made about commitments and activities that need to stop. Well, families are always responding to changes like these, some large, some small, but families are constantly in flux as they respond to changes that come from within the family, from the outside, and from things that just simply happen due to the passage of time. So let's focus our discussion for a while on how families deal with these changes. It's important for you to be aware of as a Tamarisk volunteer, because every family you work with will constantly be dealing with change, unwanted and perhaps unanticipated changes that are forced upon them due to the illness, and perhaps crises that come their way. Now, I'm sure you know that some families deal with changes more successfully than others. A few quick thoughts as we begin this discussion. First, finding equilibrium again does not necessarily mean finding health. How a family has dealt with positive and negative changes in the past will influence future changes. A family's past rules, roles, and relationships will naturally be brought into this present illness and health crisis that they are dealing with. And finally, if one family member changes, the others must adjust. So let's take a look at some helpful and not so helpful characteristics of families that will influence how they deal with the constant changes of life. That, of course, will impact how they deal with the health crises at hand when you are serving them as a Tamarisk volunteer. First, the healthy or supportive family. Here's 5 characteristics that position a family to work through these changes well. First of all, an attitude of service, of looking out for each other. If there's a secure relationship between the parents or other guardians and authority figures in the family. Parents, or again, this could be guardians or elder family members, that teach and train and encourage each family member to grow and develop as individuals. If there's in general an attitude of honor, that parents are leading with love, that children respect and obey others. If the family has shared experiences and activities on a regular basis. All of these things will help a family to weather the storms of a difficult terminal illness better. So what I'd like you to do again at this point is to take a moment to perhaps pause or stop the presentation and list on your handout some ways that your family may reflect these characteristics. Well, the foundation of a well-functioning family is a balance of love and respect that's based on a shared set of values and beliefs. This foundation creates an atmosphere where the family's rules and roles and relationships all work together to meet the goals and purposes of the family. Now, this is not to say that we're trying to paint a picture of some mythical perfect family where there's always harmony and never conflict. The point to keep in mind is how the family deals with these things in such a way that they are working through the conflicts that naturally arise with change towards the goals that they all have in common, and that they're able to look beyond themselves and consider each other in the process. An important point to note is that healthy families will more easily weather the storms of life. Family members are already accustomed to helping each other, to self-sacrifice. In this type of family, there's an openness to share feelings and fears without being threatened. They'll have an easier time adjusting to new roles. And that type of a healthy family will more likely be able to plan ahead and be prepared. So once again, feel free to please pause the presentation for a moment and make some notes that you could share with the group about times that your family, or maybe a family you know, has faced significant challenges and were able to work through those changes and decisions and maybe even conflicts in a way that was helpful, in some way had a good outcome. Well, of course, there's no such thing that is a family that perfectly weathers every storm of life. So let's take a moment to look at some characteristics that might not be so helpful for families as they deal with changes. Please keep in mind again that my goal in highlighting the healthy versus dysfunctional family is not to have you become experts in theory, nor is it to equip you to analyze every family you work with as either healthy or dysfunctional. Certainly not. My goal is to equip you with some general concepts that will help you to better understand the families you work with, to be able to accept them just as they are, and to assist you in making some good choices about how you may be able to help them, or maybe not help them, as they walk through the changes and the health challenges they are facing. So some general thoughts about a dysfunctional family. The essence of a dysfunctional family is that perhaps parents are unable to meet the emotional needs of their children. What is meant here is those intangible needs that every human has, core needs of feeling accepted, that they have value as a person, value as a member of the family. Every person needs to be loved unconditionally and have a sense of meaning and purpose for their life. In a dysfunctional family, in some way, that's often not communicated to the children. And when those core needs are missing as a child grows, emotional problems and difficulties as adults can be the result, that are then carried on into their own families. A dysfunctional family is an unhealthy place where family members adopt destructive behaviors in order to cope with pain, with suffering, with fear, with loneliness that come with those unmet needs. Sometimes family members experience verbal, emotional, physical, and maybe even sexual abuse. As a volunteer, you likely would not see this overtly or right away, but these might have been experienced by some of the family members we serve, and we'll talk during our training event about what to do if you should be concerned about that. A family that doesn't function well might be characterized even by negative or unwritten rules that don't talk about this, don't trust this person, and don't feel these sorts of things. And with all these thoughts in mind, perhaps the key thing to remember again as a Tamarisk volunteer encountering families that are going through a major change and crises is that these kinds of troubles will only be magnified in times of stress for a dysfunctional family. So recall again that in a healthy family, we said that rules and roles and relationships all work together to meet the family's goals and values. In a dysfunctional family, a family that doesn't function well, family rules are often either too restrictive or too loose or don't exist at all. Rules and traditions and expectations may be more harmful than helpful. Family relationships are hurtful and bring each other down. They may be too close, enmeshed, or codependent, too distant. Perhaps people are cut off or just simply aloof and don't communicate. Or maybe inappropriate. For instance, the child is taking responsibility due to the depressed parent. In a dysfunctional family, family roles no longer exist for the greater good, but become self-driven to help each individual family member cope. There are 4 basic roles that psychological theory identifies that children adopt in order to survive growing up in a dysfunctional family. Again, please don't feel the need to memorize those, but perhaps you'll recognize someone who's played these roles in a family you know. The responsible child, the family hero, the one who's acting out, the scapegoat, the placater, the mascot, the adjuster, the lost child. And once again, I would ask at this time that you'd pause or even stop the presentation to complete questions 2, 3, and 4 of the volunteer reflection. Being aware of your own family history and how you personally handle these stresses will help you again be better prepared to effectively serve other families as they confront stresses and changes of life-threatening illness. Perhaps you can think of a situation to share with a group about a family that successfully worked through a challenging change or one that didn't. And so that gives you an example perhaps of how not to deal with crisis. So to bring this portion of the discussion to a close, recall that we said that every family will respond to changes in a way that seeks to restore balance again. Whether that change is big, like a family I met with recently in which the wife had gone to the doctor 2 weeks prior with flu-like symptoms and was sent home on hospice with pancreatic cancer. Or small, like a patient we work with whose Huntington's disease is making it harder to get out, so the volunteer no longer drives him to Dairy Queen, but picks it up on the way to share at his home when he arrives. Families will strive to find a new sense of normal, of what works, so that all is well again. As a family tries to find a new level of balance during a crisis, their roles and expectations change. Most often, rules and relationships don't change, roles do. Think about it this way. It's easier for someone to change what they do than to change who they are. Finding balance might include things like you see in this list here. A helpful thought to keep in mind if you are in the position to make suggestions to a family working through change is to suggest first a change in roles, that they could do things differently. Second, maybe a change in rules, that expectations and traditions might need to be adjusted. And finally, do your best to honor the relationships that exist and help them to find a way, if possible, to preserve the best of what they can in their relationships. Now let's talk for a moment about some changes and issues that are unique to families of dying patients. As we've just been discussing, very often these families need to adjust how things are done or who gets things done. When a family member is dying, roles need to change. Perhaps a person who has never done the taxes or balanced the checkbooks has to take on this responsibility. Decisions that families need to face might be: who takes over the duties of the ill family member, such as paying bills, cooking, lawn care, shopping, caring for the children? Who becomes the mediator, the decision maker for medical or finances? Who's the researcher who learns about the illness, the care options, Medicare? And the list just goes on. Who takes care of the primary caregiver while the other family members focus on the one who is ill? Family members grieve ahead of time as they anticipate the loss of a loved one. And another issue that families of dying patients face: family members might struggle with conflicting feelings of guilt, sadness, relief, anxiety, and fear. And of course, all of those feelings are okay. We'll talk more about that in our presentation about grief. Family members struggle simply to maintain daily functions such as making meals, sleeping, going to work, while also caring for the people they love. Caring for a terminally ill person is exhausting, often a 24-hour job. As a volunteer, don't underestimate the value of offering help with simple tasks such as simply being in a room with an ill person so the caregiver can attend to other duties without interruption, or even for a nap. Families become exhausted by being torn between their strong emotions and sometimes societal pressures to not show their feelings. Friends and distant family often are unaware of the extent of the burden and are simply unaware of the challenges and issues families of dying patients face, unless they've been on a similar journey themselves. Families can also be torn between wanting things to stay the way they used to be, wanting it all to be over with, and not wanting to lose their dying loved one. And I'd invite you once again to just take a moment and pause the presentation and add to our list here issues that families of dying patients may face that you've witnessed or experienced yourself that you can share with the group. Finally, with all these thoughts in mind about how a family works and how they work through changes to find balance, let's take a few moments to list some helpful suggestions for you and the volunteer's role with the families that you serve. Our list here is collective wisdom from Tamarisk volunteers and staff over the years. And perhaps as you go, you'll think of some advice to add to the list, and make a note then to share with the group. The relationships, rules, and roles of the family will most certainly impact you. And I know we've said this already, but what affects one person will affect the entire family. Obviously, for one member of the family to have a terminal illness, it'll have a major impact on everyone in that system. You will be working with this family during times of change. Some members of the family might welcome you and what you bring to their ill loved one. Others might be threatened. They might have a hard time accepting help from a stranger. Perhaps they don't like that their ill family member is sharing things with you that aren't shared with the immediate family. There could be lots of reasons for that. Some thoughts specifically about working with a family. Talk with the client you'll be serving directly about what they expect from you. Work towards clarity about days, times, and length of visits, of course, but even about how they'd like you to interact and participate with their family. For instance, is it best for you to leave the room during a family discussion, or are they comfortable with you sitting quietly with their loved one as issues are discussed? Expect some amount of stress. Change is always stressful, and this may be the first time in years that family members, now adult siblings, have had to make real decisions together, perhaps about their ailing parent. You will not change their family system or fix a bad situation. If you try, you most often become mixed up in part of the problem. Instead, talk with your supervisor, discuss it at staff meetings, volunteer meetings, and look for ideas and ways to stay neutral and to be helpful where possible. Each person involved seldom takes responsibility for their role in any dysfunction. You might recognize this by family members blaming others when sharing about challenges. You are not the arbitrator. This is true whether this be an internal family conflict or when the family needs to make a decision about their care for the loved one. Don't take sides or give your opinion about other family members, even when asked. Your job is simply to be sensitive, to be aware of the dynamics as they're being played out. It is important to respect how a family handles a situation, even if you don't agree with it or it makes you uncomfortable. Boundaries are extremely important here. As a volunteer, make every effort to stay outside of any dysfunction in the family system, but to respond in a way that encourages health. So how can you know if you've crossed a line or are getting engaged with the issues a family is facing in ways that you shouldn't? Well, here's some thoughts again that are gathered by our volunteers that you might find helpful. First, check in with yourself and how you're feeling. A good rule of thumb is to check if you're able to walk away at the end of the day, or if you find yourself constantly thinking about a solution, upset about the situation, or feeling like it's all on your shoulders to resolve. It can also be helpful to reinforce the reason you are there. First of all, for that patient you serve, not necessarily the entire family. If things seem complicated, it may help for you to narrow in and to clarify your role. Strengthen and stand by your boundaries. Perhaps even write down your own list of what you feel your role and responsibilities are and are not for this family, and make a point to stick by them. This can also be a helpful discussion to have with your supervisor or at a volunteer meeting. Your feelings are the best indicator of proper boundaries. If you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed out, you might be too involved. And here's some other thoughts that are always helpful when dealing with families that we serve and any challenges they're facing. Listen with open ears and a non-judgmental heart. Even if you don't have an answer, people always appreciate knowing that you care. Be calm. Provide a sense of normalcy, even when everyone else is perhaps freaked out. Don't try to fix. Accept people where they are and not where you think they should be. Well, to finish up here on our session on family dynamics, before the training event, please put these ideas and suggestions to use by completing the case scenarios in your volunteer information binder. Each of these scenarios are representations of actual or typical situations that our volunteers have encountered in our work. Thinking through how you might handle each of these situations will help you prepare to work with each family you serve, whether that day be joyful or challenging. We will discuss